Thank you for joining our ACES Connection webinar, Trauma-Informed Schools, a conversation with Jim Sporleder. I'm Laurie Udesky, a staff reporter with ACES Connection. ACES Connection supports communities to heal trauma and develop resilience. It's an active social network of more than 26,000 people nationally and internationally. We recognize the impact of adverse childhood experiences on behavior and health and promote resilience building practices and policies. We invite you to join ACES Connection. Let me go over some housekeeping. I'm going to start by asking Jim some questions from educators who are part of the ACES Connection community. Then we'll open it up so participants can ask questions. To write and submit your questions, please click on the icon at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. And just so you know, you can start doing that now if you like. This webinar is going to be an hour long, and we're going to be recording it, so it will be available to participants afterward. Jim Sporleder is a 28-year veteran of the Walla Walla School District in Walla Walla, Washington. He retired in 2014 as principal of Lincoln High School. Under Jim's leadership, Lincoln High was transformed into a trauma-informed school and gained national attention due to a dramatic drop in out-of-school suspensions, an increase in graduation rates, and in the number of graduates continuing their education. These dramatic changes at Lincoln caught the attention of filmmaker Jamie Redford, who spent a year filming at Lincoln, resulting in the documentary Paper Tigers, which has enjoyed wide critical acclaim. Jim Sporleder, it's a great honor to have you talking to us today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Laurie. It's so great to be a part of the program.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you, and this, of course, is just a general picture for people who are unaware about the story of how the culture at Lincoln High changed to a trauma-informed school. Could you please describe what it means to be a trauma-informed school?
Well, for me, the transformation actually began when community champion invited me to a conference, and I heard Dr. John Medina. It was the first time I actually heard about toxic stress and heard about what it means when the brain's being overflowed with cortisol. But the most striking thing that I heard that day was that when kids are in the highly escalated and in the lower part of the brain, that they physiologically can't learn or take in new knowledge and problem solve. So that really blew my 28 years of philosophy that all kids can learn. And I always believed that behavior was a choice, and it was always to help kids get over the hump and be responsible for their actions versus excusing it. So that day for me, it was just a complete realization that my discipline was not teaching like I would have argued that it was, that I was still punishing. And that's what drove the transformation within me. I came back, shared that information with my staff, shared that discipline was going to be looking differently. I was so fortunate to have a staff that really got behind the information that I was sharing with them. They were relationship oriented. For many of them, it was not a hard shift to make. Of course, we did have some naysayers, like every building would have. But it was coming back and sharing the science and sharing that we need to take a different approach in how we look at students, and especially how I looked at discipline.
And so what was that shift? I mean, you started out, you developed, you shared the science that you had learned. And if I came into the school once you had implemented trauma-informed practices, what would I see?
If you were to come in and observe me in the disciplinary arena, you would see that I had moved away from reacting to the behavior and then telling students what the consequence was, or telling them a life story of why their behavior is inappropriate and how it was our job to help them make that transition when they got out of high school. You would have seen the differences that I began asking students what was going on, and I would respond. And then just that change, kids actually started telling me what was going on. And it was just compelling from the very, very beginning. Just that small minor change of reacting to asking, and then responding to what I was hearing. I mean, kids are starting to tell me what was going on in their lives, and in my head, I was thinking, how the heck they even make it to school today? Versus before, I missed that entire opportunity. One last thing that you would see is that I gave students time to come down. I would not go into problem solving with a student until I gave them time to de-escalate. I would not bring a escalated student into my office and try to push them through a problem solving situation. If you came into the entire school, what you would notice, you would see high adult visibility. You'd see high adult positive interactions going on between students and staff. And you would feel our culture. Many times people would say, something's different here. I can't articulate it, but something feels good. And I think it was just the positive interactions between our students and staff, and that gave out positive energy that people just seemed to pick up when they came through our building.
Mm-hmm. So can you describe what strategies did you use at your school to get staff and community buy-in? And I'm really looking at staff and community buy-in. So you could maybe answer those separately, because in some ways they are separate questions. For implementing trauma-informed practices, just take it from there, and then I have follow-up.
Well, first, you got to go back to 2010, because that was the first year that we implemented. So a lot of the things that we have available to us now were not available then. And some of the things that are very entrenched now were just coming on. Even mindfulness was just barely being talked about. So when you say, what did we have? We had enough staff development to, first we found out it's not a curriculum. We were hunting for the curriculum. How do you put this into place? We found out, for me, that was devastating that it wasn't a curriculum, because I wanted the how-to. And then we had a staff development. Natalie Turner from Spokane came down and did staff development before we started the year. And we picked out 3 concepts from Natalie that we were able to put into implementation. And one was we learned about how our dysregulation impacted our students when they were dysregulated, and the importance of keeping our triggers under control. And so therefore we learned that first step is we had to drop our personal mirror, that the behavior was not about us. And as we learned that, the second step was that we learned that when our students were escalated, we needed to give them the time to come down, which I shared. Kids would tell us they weren't gonna calm down. And rather than reacting in the old traditional way, we would just simply say, I know, you can't. Your brain's not in the spot where it'll allow you to come down. And so allowing them to calm down, and it didn't take much more than 10 minutes, 15, and bringing a student in who was regulated allowed us to get into the problem solving and just talking about the options and actually finding out what was behind the behavior. And what was our motivation is that we learned that if we were able to follow those two steps, it led to positive adult relationships, which we learned from the research that it only took one caring adult relationship to have an impact on a student's life path. So that was so compelling to us that we felt if one adult was able to change a life, why wouldn't we want to put as many caring adults around our kids as we possibly could? And that kind of began our intent, and it really was the students who fueled our fire because of the positive response that we were seeing, and it was immediate. It wasn't something that we waited for. It was happening right away.
So in terms of getting buy-in, I wonder if you can suggest some general strategies for schools and districts to get staff and community buy-in. And I guess one of the things I would say is, like, how do you convince skeptics?
That's a great question. I'm not sure there's the silver bullet answer because each one is individual. It's something that I'm asked consistently as I'm traveling. The way I handled skeptics was that I would share that we were following what the research was guiding us. The research is very compelling. And I shared that the traditional approach, which I always shared, was part of my style for 2/3 of my career. I was a traditional disciplinarian, that it caused me to have to step out of my comfort zone and look at a new way of approaching students. And so I would share that the traditional approach was just as compelling, that we were failing kids. And that for my skeptics, I told them I would meet them on common ground, but they had to bring me the research to support where they were at. And that was a little bit of a struggle because it's pretty difficult to find research that'll support punishment.
So, and then I'm assuming that some of the research that you were showing them was research about adverse childhood experiences and that how that affects the brain, as you had mentioned earlier.
And the pipeline to prison research, that we were putting kids on a slippery slope through the prison just through the out-of-school suspensions. And I used out-of-school suspensions for what I thought were major infractions. Mm-hmm. I use them consistently.
Mm-hmm. Did you have some specific strategies, general strategies that schools and districts can use to get their staff on board and their leadership on board?
Well, I always say that in education, everything that we should be doing, it's part of our history, is that we use evidence-based research to help guide our decisions. So I don't see any difference why we wouldn't use the research to be guiding our practices with student discipline and with developing those caring adult relationships. So I go back to the basics when I'm teaching a school on how to become trauma-informed, and I use those simple steps because I think what we have now, we have an incredible movement. It's moving across our country. It's building momentum. We've got more information now than we've had. It's exciting, but I think there's some real misconceptions that come out of that. And what I've noticed is we tend to want to separate out who's trauma, who isn't. I see that as an area that can become a challenge, or us deciding how we're going to discipline one group of kids versus how we're going to discipline another group of kids. Whereas if we truly understand the research, we understand that this is not just trauma kids, it's best practice for every single kid. And who doesn't benefit from a caring adult relationship? I've got 6 grandkids and 2 of them that are in the public school system. I want them with a trauma-informed teacher, because even though they come from healthy homes, I want them acknowledged. I want teachers caring about them. I want them to have that positive influence on their lives and their development. And that's what I want for every single student.
Mm-hmm. So what are some concrete steps toward becoming a trauma-informed school? I mean, how do you make it happen? Like your school was relatively small. How do you make it happen on a larger scale?
I personally believe the strategies are the same in school as they are in our social services. I think it's the same for law enforcement. It's our understanding. I always share, I don't believe trauma-informed is something that we do. I think it's who we become. So when I truly understand that it's my triggers, it's my regulation that needs to be in control, or I need to be in control of my triggers so that I can have a teachable moment with this student or client or an adult or whoever, then I have a chance to make a difference. If I'm dysregulated and I'm working with a dysregulated student, I've just lost a teachable moment, and I just lost a chance to be that caring adult to help that child find hope, healing, and model resilience. But if I am able to keep myself in check, keep myself regulated, now I'm in a me with you situation with that student, and I'm in a teachable moment. And the research tells us if I'm a calm adult, I can get a dysregulated student to calm. And if I'm a calm adult, I represent safety. And I believe relationships start with accountability. And I believe that it's through that process that we really start developing the trust and relationships, that we can start seeing those behaviors change, and that we can start helping these kids. They're dependent upon us. They don't, we assume they come to school prepared. They need an adult to teach them. And for me, that's a priceless opportunity to be able to play that role.
So how do you go about training a whole school? Like, do you close down the school to have a training? Do you train some of the teachers and then they train others in some of the practices? What are some of the ways in which you can do that without disrupting the whole school environment?
My personal belief on that is that we train the entire staff. We don't just train the teachers, we train everybody. Our para-educators, our secretaries, our custodians, everybody plays a significant role in developing this culture. And everybody has something to offer. I don't think it's a hierarchy movement. So I believe we need to have a day in which everybody gets the same message. I think we have to teach the neuroscience in lay terms, but in practical terms, so that we can make the connections why we need to start changing our approach. And from there, to me, it's teaching that it's positive intent. When it becomes who I am and not what I do, then I have a positive intent to build as many caring adult relationships as I can. And I have a positive intent to have caring interactions with those that I meet, whether it's another staff member, whether it's a parent, or whether it's the students. to me, that whole piece comes together as the culture. And you brought up a good point. Do we shut down for one day? For me, one day of training and out is not the answer. It's the beginning. And the conversation has to carry forward. If it doesn't carry forward, the sustainability is very difficult.
So I just want to remind everybody that please, if you want to submit your own questions, there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that, write in your questions, and submit them, and we will get to that. I also want to remind people that we are recording this, so it will be available to people later on. So one of the educators on ACEs in Connection wrote, "We keep running into this dilemma. Schools are putting the cart before the horse and just want teachers to have strategies, leaving out the important foundational topics of ACEs, neuroscience, etc. I've been told, forget the theory, just give us the candy." What are important messages we can give schools to get across that becoming trauma-informed is a process that needs to happen strategically? We're using obvious ones, but wondering if some messaging you use has stood out to help them understand.
Well, first, I don't think there's any candy involved in the process. When we put the cart before the horse, to me, if I understand that correctly, when we say strategies, well, we can't have strategies until we understand the reason why. So I think we have to understand the why. Why is it that we need to change our practices? And even from that point, I think from the why, that should drive us to wanting to know the how. So that's when the strategies come in. I got to have the why. Why is it important for me? Why do I step out of my comfort zone to try this thing called trauma-informed practices? Well, when I understand that it's an opportunity to build resilience, hope, and healing in a child's life or student's life, then all of a sudden I want to know everything I can in order to be able to help that student. And so the strategies would be the horse. The why to me would be the cart. And again, what my experience was is the minute we changed our approach, the minute we started asking the students and then responding to their stress, and they started talking to us, it just opened up a whole new world. It said that we transformed Lincoln. I would say our students transformed us.
And do you have some, lessons learned in terms, obviously it's a process, as you say. And so as you're going about it, there are going to be, wrong turns or what have you. Can you give example of a lesson learned from a wrong turn and then how you corrected it?
For me, there were certain infractions that I at first, before I came across I really felt an out-of-school suspension was very appropriate. When I first went to Lincoln, it was such an out-of-control environment. The F-bomb to any staff member that would ask a student to do anything was just so common that I had a 3-day suspension automatic. That we weren't going to talk to any staff members in our building in that manner. Once we changed our approach and I used Inschool discipline, all of a sudden I found out that these F-bombs that I was reacting to had nothing to do with us. It had nothing to do with the teacher. It had to do with the stress the kid was under. And so when we asked the kids about their stress and then tried to wrap support around them, when a student is in a regulated state and you've gone through that process, that's when I brought up the accountability piece. The consequence came at the end of the conversation. And those kids were ready for it. They expected it. In fact, the big turnaround, I guess to answer your question, is that I was blown away that through that process, the kids came up on their own because we were having a conversation. It wasn't a one-way conversation from me. They were saying, I shouldn't have done that. They were saying it's not about the teacher. I need to apologize. It was just, I was blown away from it. And so that was a big takeaway from me was, oh my goodness, this behavior isn't about us. It's not pointed at us. It's a trigger from what they're carrying, from what they're bringing from the outside.
So this brings up another question that's related, and I want to remind people to ask questions. I see that we have a number, and I'm going to get to those in a minute, but you can go to the icon at the bottom of your screen, and also to remind people that this is recorded so you can hear it later on. But another question is, this is very intense stuff. We all recognize that a lot of students have experienced trauma. And so teachers and staff people and everybody have also experienced their own trauma and can be triggered, right? So I'm wondering, just in general, what are strategies that can help prevent burnout among your staff?
You know, again, I think that I'm not sure there's one answer for that, and I certainly don't. But that's not my expertise. So I want to share that first because I did not do a very good job of with myself. But what I saw that was powerful within the culture that we had is the manner in which our staff not only took care of the kids, and that communication was always moving forward. If a student was having a rough day, information got to the person that should know, and we were doing early interventions. And I always say early intervention creates prevention. So yes, it's a lot of work. It's hard work, but those interventions were teachable moments that helped create preventions, which taught kids options. So we started to see our change in our kids through their behaviors, and we started to see that improve. And the manner in which the staff would take it was very heartfelt for me. I would say, in truly a trauma-informed school, there has to be the balance on self-care, absolutely. But I don't know of a trauma-informed school that's truly trauma-informed. I don't know one school in which you could ever pull those staff out.
Where you could what, sorry?
Where you would be able to go in and pull any staff out of that school. Would they say that they have to deal with self-care? Absolutely. Would they say that it can be really tough work? Absolutely. If you said, because of that, we'll find another place for you, you would not be able to move them out of that school. Once you've seen this work, you can never go back to a traditional approach. So the part about burnout, it's tough work. There can be burnout in that we need to keep balance. I mean, I had to learn the hard way before I finally created the balance in my own life to help balance that out. But at the same time, you couldn't pull me away from this work, and you couldn't, or to pull me away from that Lincoln. It was it becomes who you are. It's your culture. It's really becomes your identity, in that is built with these relationships from these absolutely amazing kids that somehow our system has labeled as they're bad or there's something wrong with them. These kids are amazing and are capable of amazing things. We just have to teach them how to access strategies for them to become the people that they were meant to be, not where they've been defined by their ACEs or defined by their behaviors.
Can you give an example? I don't know if you could think of a particular kid to give a concrete example of a shift that occurred.
I could share. I mean, I have several, but I guess one that I always share was the first student that came in and had told a teacher to F off, in which I was not going to do a 3-day out of school suspension in the very beginning of making this mind shift. And instead of telling him that we weren't going to talk to staff that manner, I just simply said, "This doesn't sound like you. What's going on?" And he was extremely escalated. He was on the ceiling, and he just started going off and saying, "I don't know if I've told you, Sporleder, but my dad's has let me down all my life." And he started telling me about different incidents growing up where his dad had promised him something and then just let him down, didn't show up, and how upset that he was, and how his words, "I'm so pissed today." And well, while he's telling me all these incidents, I'm simply just saying, "Wow, that's gotta hurt. I didn't know that." But I'm watching this kid, this highly escalated kid, coming down. And even though he says he's pissed, he's talking to me in a normal tone. And that's where he came up with, it wasn't about the teacher. And he shared with me that it was his birthday. It was his 16th birthday, and his dad promised to sneak a car over in the middle of the night to surprise him in the morning. And he got up and there was no car. So when he came to school, the poor kid was just devastated that his dad did it to him again. And that kid went out and apologized to the teacher. He thanked me for talking to him when actually I wouldn't say we had a conversation. I simply was validating his voice and feelings. And when he went out and apologized to the teacher, he connected with his teacher. The teacher forgave him. I felt like I had a special connection that day through that incident. And that same boy, when my father passed away just a couple of years ago, sent me a message and shared that he was sorry for my loss, that he happened to know my dad through his grandparents' church, and that told me he loved me. And it was just extremely moving. And at that time, he was 23 years old. So, I mean, beyond Lincoln. And just shows me that how important these relationships are. I always say each one of us has a stone in our hand, and we have an opportunity to create our own ripples. And what kind of ripples do we want to create? What kind of impact do we want to have on our kids? And I want to have the ripples that a trauma-informed model and practices brings to a student, because those ripples create a current, and they keep going out far. 20 years down the road, our first year of teaching, we still have those ripples moving out.
Okay, so we have more questions, but I also want to mention that Jim is the author most recently with trauma expert Heather T. Ford of the Trauma-Informed School Guide for Administrators. Jim, you want to tell participants what they'll find in your new book?
The strength of the book and the purpose of writing the book. In fact, I want to give Jane Steve a lot of credit, because Jane's the one that told me that the book needed to be written. And obviously, I'm very grateful to Heather that helped make that a reality for me. I'm not a writer, but for me, it's the first how-to book. It's built on simplicity, practical strategies. And I've had principals tell me that they've been able to move their schools to a trauma-informed school by just using that book as a standalone. And I think it's the first book that's been written by somebody that's actually implemented and walked the journey. However, I think that I support all the tremendous resources that are out there. I think we're all on the same team in this journey, and I want to be complimentary and supportive of other resources as well.
Well, I wanted to thank you. That's great to hear. James Stevens, of course, is the founder and publisher of ACEs Connection. And I have some more questions, but I just want to look at a question that's come in from one of our participants who says, Jay, who says, oftentimes validation of the issue is the key, but how do you help your staff have the time to validate feeling when they have a class full of kids?
We know that students that come from trauma, and adults as well, the one thing that's very evident is they don't feel like they have a voice. So it's so important that we validate the voice. It doesn't have to be a sit-down counseling session. I think that's where some of the confusion can happen. It can just be in the way that we approach the student, but that we validate the voice, we validate their feelings, we don't validate the infraction. And so that can be simple as, if a student's disrupting, is that I walk over and say, you're making it very difficult for me to teach right now. And this is a conversation between the student and me. There's no audience. It's quiet. And I simply share, I'm concerned that you're okay. What do you need from me right now that takes care of you, so that I know you're okay and yet allows me to teach? And we don't ask kids those questions. And a lot of times, if we would ask those types of questions, they'll tell us. Or we can share with the student, it seems like you're having a rough time right now. Would it help you to put your head down for a minute? I'm okay with that. Just allow me to teach. And it's through the relationships. I'm not, we have to front load this stuff, but with a lot of these kids, they'll respond because they're not used to us asking them, what do you need from me right now that helps you? And then allows me to teach. So to me, that's one of the confusions about the actual practices, is that some teachers have such a compassionate heart. It's like, where am I ever going to have the time, because I'm not a counselor, to sit down and invest? And I always say you shouldn't be counseling, because that's out of our expertise. We should have counselors doing the counseling, but it's our compassionate approach when we're interacting with the students.
How do you find funding to implement trauma-informed practices?
First, I always share that love's not a budgetary item. It can come freely. And to me, this is a model that's based in love, unconditional love. So when we are working with our kids, to me, that's in the forefront of our minds, is that this is a hurting child. They deserve whatever, we're not asking to treat these kids any differently than what we would expect ourselves. I want to be loved. I want to be loved unconditionally. I want to be accepted. I want my voice to be heard. Why wouldn't we give the same opportunity to our kids? Especially when we know that some of these kids are carrying around such incredible burdens and so much pain, that why wouldn't we want to be the one that teaches them that they're loved, that they have worth, that they're important, and that they're important to us, and we care very much about them. And then knowing that that could be a game changer gives me goosebumps.
So here's a question from Gina. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. How could you hold students accountable for continued disrespect and physical aggression towards student staff while still being sensitive?
First off, safety is number one. So safety is number one priority. My job's to keep that student safe and the other kids safe. So I would say that if a student is hurting kids ongoing or a safety risk, that we would need to be having very serious conversations on how can we create an environment for that student that's safe for that student and safe for other students. So the accountability piece comes in that might be a least restricted environment for that student. And that's how it all is in our language and how we frame our language. When I share to that student, you're very important to me, and that my job is to keep you safe as well as other kids safe, and I care about you. I'm going to have you stay close to me today because you mean that much to me. To me, that's holding them accountable, and also we're keeping them in close proximity so that we're not having some of those incidents. For kids that are really disrupting our classes to where they have to be taken out, one of my big learnings has been that nothing's 100%, but most of these kids that are disrupting our classes are showing signs of disrupting prior to the blowout. So if we're observing, we can catch them early in their escalation to do interventions much more earlier, which helps with prevention. And if we can keep a student regulated, then we have an engaged student, and we have a student that's going to be able to learn and be able to process. And so we have to have options within our system so that if a student has to be removed, we have a safe place for them to go, but we also have a way of them coming back where they see us all working together because we care about them. In other words, I can't send a student out for someone else to fix the problem and then not accept them when they come back. That would not be a trauma-informed model. Trauma-informed model is if I do have to send that student out and somebody else is working towards regulation, is that when that student comes back to me, I welcome them back. And that we have a plan. And somewhere in there would be a consequence for whatever the outburst was. We don't, I always say, we don't give a pass for tearing a classroom up, but it's in on how we respond and how we talk to the student is the key.
Do you have a particular way that you have worked with students that you can talk about, besides listening to them, talking to them about accountability? Are there certain things that they do where they are showing how they're accountable?
I guess any student that I've taken the time to process with and give them the consequence at the end, and they're expecting it. I mean, what I always say with accountability has two definitions. It can either mean punishment, and we know that if we punish kids, that means hurt. And if we're punishing kids, we have what we have right now with the pipeline to prison. If accountability means to teach, I want that student's discipline to change. I want to see improvement. Then that type of accountability, I actually am improving behavior and I'm building relationship through the process. And I become that safe adult that student can relate to. Now I have all kinds of flexibility to help that student with their behavior and in changing that. And so we have to decide how are we defining accountability, and also what is our goal with accountability. I noticed with my Lincoln kids, the more that we became skilled, the quicker the lessons were learned. So what might have been a 3-day in-school suspension, I found out I could do a 1-day very easily, because the lesson was usually learned before they left the office. And it happens in the context of relationship.
So Danae is writing, our district believes one training should make us all trauma-informed practitioners. In all that I've read, teachers need time and continuous education to have the tools in our tool belt to assist these students. What can we do? Oh, I just, wait a minute, that just moved away. So what can we do to convince our leadership that we need, ongoing support?
That's an excellent question and very good insight. We can't implement a trauma-informed model on a 1-day in and out training. The training should provide some direction. If I've learned anything in the last 3 years, it's if the leader is not leading the movement, it's not going to happen. So when I go out and train, I'm working with, in fact, I won't train unless I know the principal's on board and they're present with their leadership team. And so I feel like that's where the sustainability is that we got to take our champions that are willing to make this move, get behind them as much as we can, so that they become the champions that train their peers, so that the training comes from within eventually. But we've got to keep the conversation never stops. It's always got to be driving forward. And what drives it forward is because that's who we are. It's not what we do, it's who we are. And so my solutions are always wrapped around how do we build and support more caring interactions around the students.
How do you feel about students who've experienced trauma being placed in one school in a self-contained classroom for kids with quote-unquote behaviors? Is there any research that supports that this is a best practice for our students?
I'm not sure I understand the question. A student that's known to have trauma is specifically put in a class with other kids that are also trauma impacted?
That's what it sounded like the question.
Yeah. First, I would say that we're missing the point there, that remember, it's best practice for all kids, so we shouldn't be separating kids out as who we think's trauma, or we shouldn't have trauma classes for these kids, but the kids that we think are doing okay are over on this side, because your most compliant student can be your most traumatized. And as we know, some kids that have experienced severe trauma, some ways that they cope is that they excel in school. So they don't cause behavioral issues and they excel very high academically. So we'll tend to think they've got it together and they're okay. And the ones that are more disruptive will think, oh, well, they're the trauma ones. That's why it's who we are as a culture. It's who I am as a person. It's who we are as a school. Therefore, we don't miss anybody.
What one questioner is asking, Carrie, what did your in-school suspension room look like?
My in-school suspension room was very flexible. I taught kids about their brains. I taught them about their triggers. I taught them that if they got to me before they lost it, before their triggers went off, I had all kinds of options. I told them if your trigger goes off in class, I don't have as many options. So get to me before like you're going to lose it. And what happened with me, and I allowed kids to request they could time themselves out. So what happened is kids were using my Inschool suspension room to self-regulate. They would come before they lost it. They would use ISS as a way of getting them calmed down. And then when they returned to class, they returned to class calm and engaged. It was also used for disciplinary consequences. It was used, we had a couch in there. If I heard that or we as a staff knew of a family that was homeless, or one of our kids had a rough night, we'd call them in and tell them to go sleep. And the amazing part about that is kids didn't take advantage. I mean, I'd always tell a student to go sleep, and then I'd find them in the hallway much sooner than I expected, and I'd tell them, go back and sleep, and they'd say, I'm fine. They appreciated it. And the being able to self-advocate for a timeout, kids appreciated that. So very few kids took advantage of that opportunity. And I allowed my teachers that same opportunity with kids.
Mm-hmm. Somebody's asking about, Holly's asking, my understanding of the trauma-informed schools best practice approach is that screening students is recommended at Tier 2. Tier 1 is the universal whole school approach. Could you please address this, as it sounds like it could be something different?
The pre-screeners, I don't have any experience with that, to be honest with you. And I guess my only response to that, I've heard where pre-screening can be effective, but sometimes I get a little bit nervous over that. At Lincoln, I never once asked a student what their ACE score was. I asked them where their stress level was. That's all I needed to know, was where they were with their stress. And I'd ask them 1 to 10, where are you? 8. That's way too much stress for you to be carrying. I can't handle an 8. How can we help you with that? Is it coming in from school or outside of school? Never had a kid tell me it was coming from Inschool. They always, when they were calm, would say, man, it's coming from outside of school. And so I'm a little concerned about sometimes if we start screening and asking, we could be triggering kids. That's just been a concern of mine.
Mm-hmm. Have you done, so you haven't done any ACE screenings in the classroom?
We talked about ACEs with our kids, and one thing about Paper Tigers, it shows the kids actually taking an ACE test. Jamie couldn't be there every day to film. We actually gave our students the test electronically. It was an opt-in, opt-out, and it included much more than just the ACE questions. It included a lot of, in fact, it was predominantly more health-related questions, so that our health center would be able to look at the student survey responses and be able to say, hey, are we meeting this specific needs, the patterns that were showing up in our surveys? For me, the student survey gave me an average of what our students' ACE scores were as a building. That was important to me because I could match it up to what I was seeing coming in through the office for discipline referrals. And our kids went from 3.5 to 4.5 to 5.5 averages. And even in those types of increases, our discipline still continued to go down. Our test scores went up, and our graduation rates went up above the state average for traditional high schools.
So when you gave those surveys, what sort of things did you talk about to the kids to prepare for that?
The teachers would review some of the questions that would be on the survey. Again, it was an opt-in, opt-out. We didn't force any kids to take it. It was very invasive. I mean, it was how many sexual partners have you had? How many times have you drank alcohol and blacked out within a month? So there were a lot of questions that were asked that again, our health center, in fact, we had to increase our mental health services because of information that we were picking up from our student surveys to make sure we were covering the needs of our kids. And that was one way that we were able to get feedback. And also it gave us feedback for the mental health counselors to affirm, yes, we're seeing this coming through our doors.
Okay, we still have several questions left, and we don't have a lot of time, but we do have some more questions. But I do want people to know that on ACES Connection, there is an ACES and Education community, which has close to 800 members, where people are asking all the kinds of questions that people on this webinar are asking. And Jim also participates in it frequently, so it would be another way for you to potentially interact with him. But to continue on, another question from one of the participants is mindfulness or other resilience building practices offered at Lincoln High for students and for staff? And if so, what is the feedback about introducing those practices into school?
Mindfulness was just coming out when we were really picking up momentum. I think mindfulness is such a powerful strategy and tool to be teaching our kids. So if I would have had more knowledge there and if I would have been at Lincoln a little bit longer to really understand mindfulness at the time, I would have definitely appreciated having that, not only to teach to my kids. I think we as a staff would have really benefited from that information with our own self-care and taking care of one another. So that's a great question, and yet, yes, I think mindfulness is extremely powerful.
So you brought in other mental health providers based on what you had discovered and screening and surveying the kids. Were there some other things that you put in place? Like mindfulness was not really happening so much then in schools. What were some other things that happened in the actual day-to-day interactions?
You know, I think when you look at Lincoln and you look back, and again, when you go back to 2010, and even restorative practices was just being talked about. So what we have today compared to what we had in 2010, even 11, 13, there's so much more resources available now than then. But those core principles that I keep talking about, dropping your mirror, allowing kids to de-escalate before you go into problem solving, and that is what helps build relationships, and that's what helps kids begin to change the negative belief system they have of themselves, is when they know that their voice is heard, their feelings are validated, and that they're cared about and loved. It's all we had at the time, and there's a lot of resources I see now that I think, wow, that would have been great to have taught, but those core principles carried us to where we were able to move our entire school to where we got. So it's a mind shift, and that belief system, and I'm going to call it transformation. It truly transformed us as a staff.
Okay, let's see. I think we have we just have a couple minutes left, and I wonder if there's anything else that you would like to add, Jim. just in terms of takeaways for people. I think that we're hoping to, we're going to have a recorded, this webinar will be recorded so people will have access to it. And I'm also going to copy out some of the questions that didn't get answered, and maybe those could be answered later on in some form or other, or you can continue the discussion on ACEs and education, on ACEs Connection, because there are a lot of people who are chiming in on that, and including Jim. But Jim, just finally, if there are any sort of last words that you want to give to your fellow educators around the country about how to push this forward in their schools or districts.
You know, first off, I love educators. And so the folks that have called in today, I truly have a lot of affection for them and what they do. I guess my closing remarks, and maybe, and I don't mean for it to come across as too simplified, but I truly do think that in some cases we're making the process of becoming trauma-informed as if it's rocket science versus the practical implications. That I keep going back to those simple strategies that I've shared and concepts that I've shared. And if I can embrace those concepts, I am trauma-informed. And I'm practicing trauma-informed, and my transformation will have started. And I will very quickly get to the point of saying I could never go back. I had a teacher in Wisconsin this last week come up to me and say, I changed my practices. I can't believe the difference that what I've been seeing. And he gave me some examples with his students that were extremely powerful. And I said, could you go back? He goes, what do you mean? I said, could you go back to your old way of practices? And he goes, oh, no. He goes, absolutely not. And I said, that's how I know you got it. And when it's who we are, we can't go back. And we can't go back because it's what we see in our kids. They fuel our fire. They fuel us wanting to become better at what we're doing. We want to sharpen our tools and add tools to the toolbox for them.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for participating. As a reminder, this is recorded and you will be receiving a copy of that soon. And thank you so much for Jim Sporleder. This has been such a great honor to have you talk with us. And everyone have a good day, and thanks for joining us at this Connection webinar.